A Candidate for Murder. By Pieter E Haumann. Published by Feisty Goat Publishing. Chapter 1. 1979. Esopus van Tonder sat in the passenger seat of an armored Mercedes-Benz S-Class, keeping his eyes fixed on the road in front of him. He was scanning the surroundings for anything out of the ordinary which could pose a threat to the mission. This was nothing new to him, and at a mere 24 years old, he was already a seasoned veteran. Although he was the youngest of the collection of soldiers in the vehicle, all dressed in formal uniform, age meant little when one considered what these men had been through together. He glanced in the rearview mirror, to his former commander's face, which grew red and puffed with determination as he spoke. The wind of change is indeed blowing throughout this continent. Too long have we ignored these moving tides, believing that we can live in isolation from what tidal forces work to shift these actions beyond our borders. Borders which we seem to forget might shrink, drawing closer towards our safe cities and communities. We no longer have this luxury. Cast aside by those who would publicly chastise us for our archaic policies, but secretly push us towards conflict. Pawns, fighting pawns, in a battle where those self-proclaimed kings would sit in their ivory towers, dictating how we are to conduct ourselves. Yes, the wind of change is indeed blowing, but this is not a wind of ideology or personal rhetoric. No, this is a wind of discontent. A crimson eastern wind, broken only by an unwitting Western agent. This is not our war, but still we fight. This is not our responsibility, yet we bear the blame. There is no gain, not monetary, nor diplomatic, for us to continue in this conflict. Jimmy Jacobs sat staring out into a vast nothingness in front of him, embracing the cheers and adoration of a phantom crowd and contemplating the meaning of his words. His right hand squeezed pensively at the scarred wound on his knee, while the other was determinedly gripping the handle of the rudimentary mopane cane resting next to him. "If you continue talking like that, people will start calling you a communist," said Ma Lun, staring emotionlessly out the window of the armored Mercedes into the thick bush along the road. He turned to face Jacobs, whose eyes were still fixed on the open road. Next to him sat Nkosi, who appeared to be asleep, with his head resting against the window but listening intently to everything being said around him. In front of him, in the passenger seat, sat Van Tonder, and in the driver's seat, Santos. These 5 men knew each other better than most brothers. A brotherhood born from the trials of conflict. Theirs, however, was about more than just taking a fight to the enemy. No, they were the elite. A type of soldier that could operate autonomously, behind enemy lines. They were nameless, nationless. Willing to risk it all for the mission. Never questioning. Never turning down an order. Never saying no. "They'll call anyone a communist who disagrees with the status quo," Jacob snorted. "That's the power of propaganda." "Who cares?" said Santos, who never shied away from partaking in any form of conversation, regardless of his own personal conviction. "Communists. Terrorists. It doesn't matter. There's only enemy and friend." "Enemy and friend?" asked Jacobs, his brow twitching as he relished at the thought of debating his point. "Who are we as soldiers to define who our enemy is? That is done for us. We have a job to do and that is all." "Then why are you getting involved in politics?" asked Ma Lun. "If you're just the good soldier, then aren't you going against your very nature?" "To bring about change," said Jacobs proudly. "Too long have we been fighting someone else's war. It's time for our people to accept that change is inevitable and that we should be at the forefront of bringing this about, lest we be left behind, cast aside in a rapidly evolving world." "Maybe you should save some of that for the podium later on today," laughed Ma Lun, slapping his former commander on the shoulder, and looking to Santos, who was a cheap audience, always good for a laugh or two. "What do you think?" asked Santos, turning towards Esopus, whose cold logic he had come to admire over the years. Esopus slowly turned and stared at him for a second. He was never one to be caught up in the politics of matters, at least not in a public forum. He was there to do a job, and politics tended to come in the way of duty. "Van Tonder doesn't care for politics," said Jacobs. "He's a man of action. A man with integrity. We need more of his type in this world." "I second that," said Ma Lun. "And speaking of action, why the hell are we going to this place anyway?" His question was shared by his compatriots, save for Jacobs, who had arranged a small detour on their trip from the airport to the country's capital. "Did you know that being a presidential candidate affords one access to places not available to the general public? Can you stop being cryptic for a change?" said Santos. Jacobs snorted annoyedly at the constant questioning. "Just drive," he muttered, "we're almost there anyway." The trees and bush around the car became denser, and when Santos cleared a small hill, a basin opened in front of them. In the middle of lush bushveld, stretching as far as the eye could see, right up to the stoic ridge of the Magaliesberg Mountains, stood a collection of cooling towers and chimneys, towering above the surrounding landscape. In the 1960s, to remain at the forefront of modern technology, the government ordered the creation of a top-secret nuclear research facility. The operations at this facility were kept under lock and key, with only a select few in the know as to what was really going on behind those electrified fences. Jacobs, however, having recently garnered significant political and social favor, after his military exploits had come to light, had secured an invitation to audit the facility, if only to still his personal curiosity. No doubt, the trip would be an orchestrated charade, barely scratching the surface of the clandestine nature of research being performed at said facility, but in his mind, he was one step closer to securing himself as a dominant player in the upcoming national elections, an affair which had been fraught with tension, as international pressure on the country was growing, and public sentiment for the ruling party was waning. The country was ripe for a change in governance, and who better than a war hero, turned against his former employers, to lead the charge for change. The Mercedes rolled up to the main gate, where a small militia manned the large entrance. They were dressed in black uniforms, sporting the insignia of an unknown security agency on their chest, and carried automatic rifles. Ex-military? Asked Santos skeptically, analyzing the men approaching their vehicle as he rolled up to the designated parking zone. Seems like it, said Esopus, recognizing their stance and demeanor. These men had surely undergone extensive training in a military setting. Turned private security, said Ma Lun, decent money in that job. Speaking of which. He raised his brow and shot Jacobs a stern yet determined look. I said you would get paid, didn't I? The latter replied bluntly. Here, show them this. He handed Santos an envelope. How on earth did you manage to pull this off? Asked Ma Lun as he stared at the seal on the envelope, accompanied by a red stamp reading confidential. Once they label you a war hero, you can pretty much do whatever you want. The last thing they want is to seem uncooperative. Santos handed the approaching guard the envelope, and after he had scanned the contents he signaled towards the guardhouse. There was a notable change in demeanor from the guards, with some of them saluting as the large metal gates rolled open, letting them pass through. Once through the gate, a long driveway, overgrown with lush bush, led up to the gray administration building of the facility, where 3 men in black suits stood waiting on them. What are you up to, boss? Asked Santos, staring rather skeptically at the men who awaited them. They did not seem like the type to be doing any form of scientific research, nor did they look to be part of the security force manning the facility. Just making sure I know what I'm dealing with in my campaign. All right, park right here, and wait until I return. Santos pulled the car into an open parking spot, beneath a large shady tree. Nkosi paraded out of the back seat and held the door open, while helping Jacobs to his feet. The latter straightened his uniform, while leaning against the car before placing his weight on the cane and struggling towards the welcoming committee, leaving the others waiting at the car. What do you think they're doing in there? Asked Santos as he stared after Jacobs. He turned to face his compatriots and whispered, Do you think they're experimenting on people? I read somewhere that's what's going on in there. Scientists working day and night trying to make super soldiers and stuff. I hardly think that's what they're doing, laughed Ma Lun. Do you see those towers? That's for cooling. They're just generating electricity. What do you think, Van Tonder? Esopus glanced towards the towers and then back into the bushy surroundings before shrugging. He didn't much care for what the government was doing behind closed doors, it was above his pay grade, and he had been privy to quite a few government secrets during his tenure. But even he had to agree, that mutated super soldiers sounded more than just a little ridiculous. He's been in there for 2 hours already, said Santos, scratching at a scab on his forearm, which he had been nursing for close to 3 weeks, and staring at the building where Jacobs had disappeared a few hours earlier. What time did he say we needed to be in the capital? At 3, said Nkosi sternly. Well, at this rate, we're going to be late. I hate being late. We know, laughed Ma Lun. Remember that time in Zambia? We barely had time to finish our reconnaissance and you were already firing up that rickety old naughty car. If it wasn't for that, you lot would have been overrun by militia. Nonsense, we were doing just fine. The conversation continued in this line for another 20 minutes before Jacobs finally appeared from the dark building, with the men in suits, and carrying a black leather suitcase. All done, boys, he said with a determined grin, as he struggled towards the car, where Nkosi was dutifully holding the door open for him to enter. What's in the suitcase, boss? Asked Santos, always snooping, and feeling his curiosity piqued. Leverage, my boy, said Jacobs, before cracking a determined smile. Now, let's get going, we don't want to be late. He sat with the suitcase next to him, a stern look across his face, and as Esopus caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, he cracked a determined smile. It was nearly 3 o'clock when the black Mercedes-Benz charged into the capital. The city's streets were packed with afternoon commuters, but Santos made light work of speeding through traffic, and pulled up to the large collection of onlookers, who had gathered at the Union buildings. The street had been cordoned off, with police manning every corner, after the police commissioner had earlier that week proclaimed that he would be damned if a hippie like Jacobs caused a riot in his city. And with time to spare, Santos exclaimed happily, glancing at his wristwatch, and smiling broadly whilst blasting the horn for the crowd to make way. I could have done without the constant bumping and braking, said Ma Lun, who rubbed a small protrusion on his forehead, where a rather aggressive maneuver by Santos sent him slamming into the window. I told you to hold on tight, didn't I? Enough chit-chat, Jacobs said sternly. Just stop the car here, we can walk the rest of the way. Santos pulled off to the side of the road in a loading bay and brought the car to a halt. They jumped at their positions, clearing a section around the car. Nkosi held the door for Jacobs, who struggled out and forced himself upright on the cane before gazing over the crowd of people. Would you look at this turnout? He said, smiling broadly and nodding at a few appreciative stares. An unprecedented crowd had gathered, with radio and news reporters scattered across the area, awaiting the arrival of Jimmy Jacobs. Some were there in protest of his ideological and radical views, but most were there to cheer on the man who they saw as the savior of their democracy. The man who would free their country from the stranglehold of conservative and outdated oppression. Jacobs and his security force fought their way through the crowd, with those in attendance realizing who it was pushing past them, and soon their attention was focused on him. Esopus pushed ahead, holding countless fans at bay, who were all too keen on reaching the man they had come to see. They finally made it to the front of the masses, pushing beyond the perimeter, where several policemen were manning a cordoned-off stage, encircled by red and white tape and wooden barriers. It looks like they were expecting a riot, Jacobs joked. They'll stop at nothing to make it seem like I'm inciting some sort of social revolution. He turned around, still smiling broadly, when a short woman with blonde hair, made up into a bun, and donning a pair of thick-brimmed spectacles came storming towards him. Where on earth have you been? She asked as she placed her left hand on her hip and stared up at him angrily. Relax, Maria. We had a little detour, that's all, said Jacobs, assuring the woman that everything was in order by placing his hand on her shoulder and tilting his head ever so slightly. A technique Esopus had seen him perform countless times, calming a situation or bringing someone around to his way of thinking. Maybe that was what made him such an effective leader, his ability to manage people, as opposed to managing the situation. That sounds like the kind of thing you would discuss with your publicist, now isn't it? She said sternly, but easing off the attitude. At least you know how to make an entrance. Honestly, James, it's hard enough keeping the government off your back without you gallivanting off, to who knows where. And was it necessary to bring your own private army along? What are people to think? She gave Jacob's entourage a stern and disapproving glare. When Maria Andrews took on the job of handling Jimmy Jacobs' campaign, little more than a year earlier, she was under no illusion that it would be a challenging task, but his nonchalant demeanor and charm was at times more than she could manage. Nevertheless, she wasn't one to be trifled with, and soon established herself as one of the very few people whose opinions Jacobs respected. Maybe it was her years of working as a high-profile lawyer that hardened her skin, or maybe it was her stature that caused so many to underestimate her prowess, like a rabid Jack Russell Terrier, waiting for the perfect opportunity to pounce. It's to make a point, said Jacobs. After all, you said that I should present myself as the war hero the public has come to recognize. Very well, she said, fixing the spectacles on her nose and whipping out a folder containing Jacob's itinerary for the day. We have a busy day ahead of us and we're already behind schedule. She gave Jacob's comrades a steely stare down. Would you lot mind keeping yourselves busy? I hardly think there's anything to be worried about here. Jacobs held up 2 fingers and whipped his hand forward, indicating that they should scan the crowd for any possible threats, which they obliged, leaving him with Maria and their itinerary. She's a feisty one, said Santos as he and Esopus made their way through the crowd, with the former staring back at Jacobs and his publicist. Careful now, said Esopus, scanning the faces around them for any suspicious-looking individuals. The presence of their uniforms brought on a mixed array of reactions, with some making way for them to pass and others standing deliberately in their way. I don't think she'll take too kindly to you talking about her like that behind her back. It doesn't matter anyway, I heard that she and Jimmy have more than just a professional relationship, if you know what I mean. Don't believe everything you read in the newspaper, said Esopus, pushing past a pair of anti-Jacobs protesters, who were holding up a banner reading, "Get out, commie." They were some of the deliberately in the way bystanders. Well, it's more than just the newspapers. Didn't you see that interview he did on television the other week? She was there in the background, staring at him like a schoolgirl at her crush. I don't care for gossip, said Esopus. Everything's a soap opera if you want it to look that way. In any case, we should be alert. I have a bad feeling that something might happen today. You're just being paranoid. These are civilians, what could they possibly do? And you should stop reading those books of yours and spend a little more time in the real world. It's better to be safe than sorry. Esopus ignored Santos' second statement. After all, it was through those exact books that one could learn the real workings of the world, not through sensationalistic news articles and propaganda-fueled exposés. After making a few rounds of the crowd and ensuring that there were no dubious individuals lurking among the masses, the team met up again at the stage, a metal frame with a series of loudspeakers at the back, and a podium at the front, with Jacob's face adorning all but the most obscure corners of the setup. It stood in stark contrast with how they had come to know Jacobs, and Esopus took a moment to take in the almost ridiculous self-promotion, taking place in front of them. No doubt, it was Maria who had orchestrated this farce. All good? Asked Ma Lun. He and Kosi had taken the street side of the gathering and finished their rounds as well. A few of the onlookers gave them a disgusted look as they gathered at the foot of the stage. Don't mind them, said Santos when he noticed that they were fixing their gaze on Kosi, with some shaking their heads and mumbling under their breath. I'm not bothered by ignorance, the big man replied. After all, he was hard not to spot, and at 6'6", he was only overshadowed by the ridiculous stage behind them. All right, gentlemen, said Maria, who came strolling towards them. She was smiling, and clearly not on their behalf. Colonel Jacobs will take the stage in less than a minute. Now, since he is so adamant that you appear on there with him, please conduct yourselves in as professional a manner as you can. We don't want to scare off any of our voters, now do we? She ordered them in line and walked them towards Jacobs, who was standing at the first step to the stage, clutching his cane and taking a moment to compose himself. He stared down the length of the mopane branch holding him upright. At times the wood seemed straight, as if the load on it was light. Today, however, it was bent to a near half-moon shape by the pressures of what the day would hold. You'll be fine, boss, said Nkosi, who placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder. The world needs to hear what you have to say. Jacobs turned his head sideways and smiled at the big man, before drawing a deep breath and raising his head, the cane shooting straight as it led him up the stairs. He approached the podium, held his head aloft and stared over the faceless masses awaiting his oration. As they all lined up on the stage behind their former commander, Esopus let his gaze drift over the sea of people, cheering the arrival of this influential man, and he thought back on how he had come to be at that place, at that point in time, while Jacob's voice echoed over the loudspeakers. The wind of change is indeed blowing throughout this continent.